So good evening and welcome to the first of the 2014 Darwin College lectures that take place every Friday evening of the Lent term. And my welcome is not just to all of you here in the Lady Mitchell Hall, but to everyone in the Overflow Hall on the video link, and also to the many, many thousands of people around the world who watch these lectures later on online, where they're freely available. Now, every lecture series is built around a multidisciplinary theme, with each speaker addressing a different aspect. And this year, with plagues, our lecturers will tackle the breadth of this major topic, issues of present and future plagues, as well as historic plagues. This is a particularly important year for Darwin College, as we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of our founding. We were the first college in the university, exclusively for graduate students, and we were the first mixed college. From a small beginning, we are now amongst the largest colleges, with an alumni body that encompasses all subjects and is spread right round the world. So in this, our 50th anniversary year, therefore we are really pleased that our first lecturer should be Professor Sir Leszek Borysiewicz, Vice-Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. Now, before becoming Vice-Chancellor in 2010, Boris was Chief Executive of the UK Medical Research Council, while in his academic career he's worked at Cardiff, Cambridge and Imperial College. Outside medicine, his keen interests include Welsh sport and especially rugby. Boris was knighted in 2001 for his contributions to medical research and education and his work towards developing vaccines, including a vaccine that protects against cervical cancer. He's also passionate about affordable medicine. Our Vice-Chancellor has helped protect millions around the world. So who better to start the 2014 Darwin College Lecture Series? And I very warmly welcome our Vice-Chancellor to speak on plagues and medicine.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm usually used to, whenever I have to speak to half-empty lecture theatres, and I'm deeply flattered and have to thank the organisers for this opportunity to address this topic. I'm going to take you on a personal reflection, which is a great way of saying, please don't blame me if I get some of the facts wrong. It's a reflection that covers many of the aspects of a field which is changing by the day. And it's one which will affect all of us in the ramifications far more than just those who might have, like myself, an interest in the science that underpins and the biology that underpins the development of infections and how we protect against them. In fact, probably the topic has got a lot more to do with society than with medicine. And that's the thought I'm going to leave you with at the end, because the questions are far more global to every single member of society than just a few of us who really are fascinated by the pathogens or by the responses to them. So it's a long journey, and I do hope that I can do it within the stipulated time, because I'm going to take you back to 1347 and the plague that hit Europe. Now, I'm not going to tell you about all of the historical details of the plague. You're going to get that from Mary Dobson next week, and she'll be able to do it far more justice than I can. But the importance of the plague in Europe was that here was the first really well-documented, huge population pandemic. It affected everybody and moved to all parts of the European area. Fascinatingly, certain pockets were not affected at all. Now, my interest is how do you prevent these activities, the activities of pathogens? And let's just think of the impact of the plague, as it then was, on society. And I'm going to turn to visual prompts. And here I'm going to turn to Peter Bruegel. Now, this picture is quite fascinating. Stare at it for a long time, because it actually shows you every grisly way of ending your life in medieval times. He delights in showing us scaffolds, showing us people being tortured on the wheel, a variety of ways of being decapitated or having other injuries inflicted on you. But if this reflects the mind of medieval man, right in the center is the plague. So what matters here is the perception of this, of how a plague affects individuals. And in medieval man's mind, despite the fact that you didn't live very long and life was very cold and hard, plague was a terrifying event. So the first question is, how do you respond to such an event? Well, if you can afford it, the first thing you do is run. I suspect most of us in this room would too. And of course, this cartoon, a quite famous cartoon, shows in 1665 the rich trying to run out of London as soon as the plague strikes. The point being made here is that the plague follows them. In fact, this is a very good way of transmitting it. Well, you've got another option. You don't know what's causing it. You have no concept of germ theory or anything else. So what do? Well, what do you do in a siege? You get inside your castle or your city, and as you can see from this woodcut of Nuremberg in 1490, you pull up the drawbridges and isolate yourself. Could work. You don't know what's causing it, but let's stop others who might be infected coming in or coming anywhere into contact with you. But behind all of this, the societies that have done this have made a conscious decision that they have restricted the rights of every individual in here to go out, or all the individuals out here to come in. In other words, the response is a societal response which has ramifications for the rights of the individual. What else can you do? Blame someone, blame anyone. Come on, we do it all the time. Religion. Remember the medieval concept that at the end of the day, this was a visitation from God to an ungodly, sinful community. The dominant church plays up to it. Why not? So what do? Well, you beat yourself. Develop the flagellant movement. Go round, chastise yourselves, make yourselves feel, prostrate yourselves before God. Surely he'll make this go away. He didn't. Or you go for sectarian violence. Blame somebody else. Blame the outliers in a particular population. It so happened, these happened to be the Jews. It also happened that they held most of your debts, so you killed two birds with one stone, so to speak. And needless to say, among this particular bonfire, you are actually burning your debts at the same time. Not a very savory way for humanity to behave, but one which uses the plague as an excuse for its implications. What other measures can you take forward? Well, what's causing this plague, this mysterious event that's happening? You've no idea about germs. Oh, things smell a bit. Dead bodies tend to smell. So miasmas might be important. Now, who are the first people to protect themselves in any outbreak? The doctors. And needless to say, personal protection comes into it, and here you get the classical idea of breathing in fresh air through a herb-filled beak that the physicians used, particularly in the 17th century. Maybe some things haven't changed at all. Who gowns up, first of all, when they see a case of infectious diseases? People try to protect themselves with crosses, and of course these were the crosses on doors as individuals were quarantined in the outbreaks. But public protection was also introduced. And again, this began to control society. The orders of the 1665 plague restricted, for example, the opening of theatres or of any public places in order to try to prevent spread of plague. So society is again taking action based within the constructs of what you believe the causation to be. Well, you can isolate cases. And the development of pest houses followed a particularly interesting observation in Milan, which first introduced them. And I'll come back to that. But these are still found on the edges of villages in Britain where these photographs are taken from a variety of sites. They don't exist for this function, but that's what those houses were originally for. And if you can't do anything for the living, then you make sure you take care of the dead. And here are the pits that actually where people were thrown into, lime usually added, and carted to their final destination on these receptacles. Fascinatingly, it's from these pits and from the DNA extracted from the teeth that we've been able to show that, in fact, the Black Death was due to Yersinia pestis, the pathogen that causes bubonic plague. So public health measures have been introduced every single time, even if we don't have a biomedical construct of the disease. But all of these failed. And we do have to think of the consequences of the Black Death, because here an epidemic and a plague impacts on society. Firstly, demographic change in Europe. Mortality rates in cities that measured it, Florence and Venice, reaching areas of about over 50% of the population died. Milan, hardly anyone. To this day, I don't think we have an answer, but the reason pest houses became very popular because Milan introduced this kind of methodology. People did talk, they did communicate, and try to look at what was going on in other centres. The total estimate of death is large, and again, I'll leave that for Mary to cover. But this sort of mortality changed our rural populations, built up city populations, and really heralded the end of the feudal system. So, again, a plague hugely impacting in the way society was organized. And lastly, in terms of beliefs. If you have a belief that this was all due to sins, and actually the church said, yeah, it was, so, do things which will change, all of a sudden, why should I believe all of that stuff? The dominance of the failure of the church hierarchy, they didn't remain anywhere near where there was a plague. They locked themselves away. Monks and friars closed off the abbeys, but monks and priests did. Friars remained within the population. What was interesting, and I'm told by ecclesiastical historians in particular, that friars became much more prominent afterwards. They were much more respected. They stayed there and took their chances with society. And although the church recovered to an extent, and we see this in certain orders thereafter, Ziegler holds that its social position never achieved the same level of respect, and he extrapolates the Black Death as being the underlying framework that helped the Reformation take effect in due course. And if you believe that can't happen today, then this is the impact of HIV and AIDS in South Africa. Infectious agents and plagues still have the capacity to change populations. In the blue bars are what the population of South Africa would look like in 2020. The green bars show you what the population profile will actually look like. The difference between the two is the impact of HIV in a country like South Africa. So these agents and plagues have a huge capacity to change the nature of society and, in fact, the demography of society and, therefore, the way society works. So I'm going to turn to another disorder for very brief reasons, because I now want to explore the way in which society actually interfaces with these events as they take place. Now, smallpox is a DNA virus. It's a disease which certainly had variable mortality in the 18th century. There were epidemics, which were well documented, as well as a baseline low-level infection of smallpox. And we wonder now whether in reality this was variola major and a minor variant called variola alastrim minor, which has a mortality of only around 1%. We know that in 1974, even with modern medicine, variola major in India was causing a mortality of around 26%. And that's the best data that we have where we could really get such information. Transmission requires close contact. And it's mostly face-to-face spread, with an attack rate, a secondary attack rate, that is the number of people who will be affected if they're unvaccinated from a single point case coming into a close household, is about 58%. So quite infectious, but not as infectious as other areas. Spread by fomites, that is clothing and other material, did occur, but it wasn't the major means of transmission. And there was an asymptomatic incubation period for part of which the individuals are infectious. Thankfully, it doesn't exist anymore. And it doesn't exist largely due to the actions of this man, Jenner. Again, I'm not going to go into the famous story about Phipps and elsewhere as to how he developed the smallpox vaccine, completely unethical in terms of the experiment they actually undertook, but hugely successful in its outcome. But what I want to focus on is, as this preventative measure was developed, what was the reaction of society to that preventative measure? And here I'll turn to cartoons, because at the start of the 19th century, cartoons became a very popular way of expressing sentiment. And here we have the classical Gilray cartoon of 1808, which shows that cows and other ailments can come out of the arms of those who are vaccinated. We might laugh at it because we have a different concept. How do you think, if you take a bit of cow, stick it in somebody's arm, wrap the arm up, and actually say, that's okay? Is it so far-fetched? 4 years later, a further cartoon by Cruikshank was published. Jenner now heralded as the saviour of children with smallpox. These are the doctors who are running away, surrounded by the corpses of those people they did not put the preventative measure in. A societal change of belief of a preventative measure in 4 years if you use these cartoons as measures. What happened? Vaccination had the approval of King George III, who publicly had his kids vaccinated. From my perspective, opinion formers were just as important at this time in medical practice as they remain today. And what happened thereafter, as depicted in various pictures, this rather interesting chocolate box image of the French school in 1830 of the vaccinator, the doctor visiting this very poor family and vaccinating children. Complete mythology. No doctor in the 1830s would be seen dead in a place like that. But nevertheless, it adds to the mythology of medical practice. What happened once vaccination was introduced? Because it's much more interesting to think, how did that event spread? There were real problems. Vaccinia itself is not, and cowpox is not a common disease of cattle. And to source an effective supply of vaccinia was extremely difficult. How reproducible was the method? How many lesions? When? What were the correlates of protection? We would have all of this terminology today. You had nothing that you could deal with. Your measures really were a body bag count as to whether actually people died or didn't die when they were exposed to smallpox. You had to resort to arm-to-arm vaccination from one individual to another. There were side effects linked to poor technique. Was it always effective? This in particular was very interesting because in London, vaccination took place in the smallpox hospitals. That meant that when you took the lymph out of somebody, you didn't know whether you were taking it out of somebody who'd had vaccination or they were actually incubating smallpox. And this led to several episodes where individuals could be promoting spread of smallpox rather than promoting its protection. Was it always effective? Well, Jenner's done an injustice in as much as in 1819 he himself was talking about revaccination being necessary to sustain protection. So there were problems, but early opposition really arose. And here is the rub. You get something that's accepted, and then what happens is opposition will come forward like night follows day. What were the main threads of opposition to vaccination? Well, the first goes back to that Gilray cartoon. It's actually bestiality. the House of Lords debated the issue at the time as to whether vaccination was akin to bestiality. Held very formally by the House of Lords, and some might say, well, maybe they should have known at that time. But there was a general opposition to using animal material in vaccinations. And you can see what Dr. Massey said, who was opposed to a big anti-vaccinator, that he saw the case of an ox-faced boy. He observed to me that the boy's face seemed to be transforming and assuming the visage of a cow following vaccination. We're still very good at anecdotal reports in medicine. And if you were having arm-to-arm vaccination, as you didn't know what was the material that was actually required, then the thing you wanted to know was that the child was from a good family, because at that point, you had better quality material. There was resonances with today that I'm sure are not being lost on you. There were religious objections. Dr. William Rowley, in a sermon, smallpox is a visitation from God originated in man, but the cowpox is produced by presumptuous, impious man. The former heaven ordained, the latter is perhaps a daring and profane violation of our religion. That is, let them die, but at least they'll go to heaven. So it's very interesting how this religious theme continues. And there was ineffectiveness. I've already talked about poor technique, poor sourcing of the material. So clearly, some vaccinations, we don't know what fraction, but it could be quite a substantial fraction. I would estimate maybe even as much as half of all vaccinations were ineffective. And side effects occurred, but there was no collection of data whatsoever. So we then began a move which the medical profession and society in general would like to happen. The medical profession was starting to make a lot of money out of vaccination. So what you want to do now? Well, you maximize your market, don't you? Now you compel people to have vaccination. In 1820 and in 1840, this movement started on the continent of Europe. Interestingly, it started in Prussia. But it started in two ways. In Prussia, it was direct compulsion. But in other countries, we end up with the catch-22, which is, of course, you don't have to have vaccination. But actually, in Bavaria or France, you can't get married if you haven't got a certificate that proves you've got a vaccination certificate. And that catch-22 has resonances in today's United States, where you don't have to have your child vaccinated, but if they're not vaccinated, they can't go to school and will catch you on the basis you're not educating your child. So one's got to be careful of direct and indirect compulsion in this area. And in 1840, it was announced that vaccination would now be free under the provisions of the Poor Law Act. But in 1853, you had to have vaccination. An Act of Parliament in 1853 made it the responsibility of poor law guardians, the Privy Council, and the Registrar General that you had to be vaccinated. This failed miserably. A complete systems failure, which I could go into some detail as to how that happened, but just assume that it completely failed because nobody took charge of what was actually supposed to happen. No standard operating procedures, but most magically of all, the people who were to confirm vaccination were the very people who were getting paid for doing the vaccination in the first place. What a wonderful closed-loop system that you actually develop. Parents stopped trusting the system, but parents were now in a position that they would be fined if they didn't have their child vaccinated within 3 months of birth, and compulsory birth registration was introduced. And this was increasingly matched by ever more draconian measures on the continent of Europe. And this, because it didn't really bite, was followed with acts in 1858, 1867, and 1871, which modified the 1853 Act with ever more draconian measures to force vaccination onto families. Now, people had had enough. And what actually happened is that anti-vaccination movements really took hold in Britain. Now, who were these movers, again, strong opinion formers, who were opposed to vaccination? Charles Crichton, probably not known to many of you, but the author of the biggest treatise of epidemics and infection in the late 19th century. Probably did more study of infections than anybody else. Charles Crichton's view of vaccination. It is difficult to conceive what will be the excuse made for a century of cowpoxing. It cannot be doubted that the practice will appear in as absurd a light to the common sense of the 20th century as bloodletting does to us now, and so on and so forth. The second big figure was William Tebb. Not known to many of you, but he was a very important supporter of Robert Owen, founder of the Vegetarian Society and a prominent member of the Swedenborgian sect, an anti-vivisectionist, but his major achievement was the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Children. He started a journal, the Vaccination Inquirer, which was geared towards opposition to vaccination, a spiritualist, theosophist, and pacifist, and he created the London Society that fought to abolish compulsory vaccination. However, today he's best known, if you wander around London cemeteries, for the bells you sometimes find associated with gravestones, because he hated the idea that he might be buried prematurely. And he started a society for the prevention of premature burial. Again, we might laugh, but actually this was a serious area, and in fact in his will he stipulated he must lie for 14 days till there are obvious signs of putrefaction before he's actually buried. But a very important mover and shaker at the time. Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-founder of evolution, his view of vaccination. Vaccination is a gigantic delusion. It has never saved a single life. It has been a cause of so much disease, so many deaths, utterly needless and altogether undeserved suffering. It will be one of the greatest errors of an ignorant and prejudiced age, and its penal enforcement the foulest blot on a beneficent course of legislation during our century. A brilliant mind. And lastly, if you thought it all went away in the 19th century, George Bernard Shaw, writing in 1944, at present intelligent people do not have their children vaccinated, nor does the law now compel them to. Prophesied the extermination of smallpox, but in contrary, more people are now killed by vaccination than by smallpox. He might have been right by 1944. What do they all have in common? This is not my analysis, and all of the people, there's been a historical study of the major opponents. Some quite interesting things in common. They were all socialist and social reformers. They were doing this out of a general sense that they were doing good to society. They were largely spiritualists, very strongly linked to Swedenborgianism and vegetarianism and anti-vivisection and animal welfare. None of that is meant to be critical, but it actually gives you a flavour of how individuals who were involved in other parts of control of society really thought that this was something to get involved in. And the main reasons for opposition, Crichton, actually he hated Jenner. I'm going to disagree with anything Jenner ever wrote. So that's Crichton. A disbelief in the effectiveness of vaccination. That's Wallace. Social reformers. Cause and effect. Let's not be tough on crime, let's be tough on the causes of crime. Actually, forget smallpox, let's deal with the urban problems that we've actually got, and smallpox will go away. Again, completely well motivated in terms of driving. But what unified them all was compulsion. Accepted in Prussia, accepted on the continent of Europe, to an extent accepted in the United States. For Britain, this was the final straw. Draconian penalties were cumulative. Societies developed in virtually every city in Britain to oppose vaccination. It's the compulsion of vaccination that was being opposed. And therefore this alliance of people coming with different objections was created against compulsion. And anti-medical, anti-science figures came in on the bandwagon. But being opposed to vaccination was not seen in the late 19th century as being opposed to science. In fact, you might argue you were a more rigorous scientist if you actually tried to explore whether it was effective or not. Why? Well, there was a commission, a Royal Commission of 1888 to 1896, studied for 7 years, published finally in the British Medical Journal in 1896. And this was an exploration whether vaccination should continue. So much and so loud had the noise from the objectors become. Now, those who promoted it in the medical profession were very strong. John Simon was writing a letter to the President of the General Board of Health. How many times I've heard this expressed by clinicians already in different guises beggars belief. It goes with the credulity which characterizes the present age to be incredulous of proved truth. Alike in rejecting what is known and believing what is preposterous, the rights of private foolishness assert themselves. It is but the same impotence of judgment which shrinks from embracing what is real and lavishes itself upon clouds of fiction. I must say, we've probably all said it as clinicians in one format or another in different areas, probably less eloquently than that. But the promoters, if you read the Commission reports, did not provide anything like evidence base as we would know it today. They tried to provide it by assertion. Contrast this with the work that was submitted by Alfred Wallace. He collected data. Here he was trying to show the vaccination rates in the United Kingdom and the smallpox epidemics that actually occurred. He collected data from Leicester and elsewhere. And superficially, you could interpret this data as saying, well, what is the evidence that vaccination works? The problem that arose is that the Royal Commission began to look at the statistics that are involved, and I would argue the statistical arguments, if you go through some of that documentation, and it goes to 7 volumes, so you really have to be committed to look at it, and I'm owning up now I did not read all of it, it was far better presented than the assertions of the medical profession. But there was evidence out there that it worked. And the best evidence comes really at the end of the 19th century from Sweden, where because of religious objection, people in Stockholm itself stopped vaccinating people. The rest of Sweden continued vaccination. When the epidemic of 1873 hit, it was Stockholm that was affected. People started revaccinating again in Stockholm. The epidemic went away. The rest of Sweden was marginally affected. So there was evidence, but they didn't even bother to look it up at the time. So, Alfred Russel Wallace didn't have a great view of doctors. And I'll leave you to read that for yourself. So all of this garnered together, but ultimately the objectors had their way. And in 1906, conscientious objection to vaccination was allowed. Interestingly, the Act remained in force until the 1948 NHS Act, but magistrates had almost voluntarily decided they were never going to impose those penalties. It's a very British way of dealing with it. You can object to it conscientiously, but actually we will keep the law still there and finally repeal it in 1948. By 1966, the number of smallpox cases was diminishing. Asia was declared free, and the last fatality, tragically, a laboratory accident in Birmingham. And that picture is where, up until 20 years ago, the last remaining smallpox in Russia was actually held. It's an Electrolux fridge, actually, if you look at it. So Alfred Russel Wallace was right and wrong in equal measure, a man who I admire enormously. He stood for rigorous analysis. He stood for the values of the right to choose in defense of the right of parents and individuals to object, a very important societal principle that he was able to win over. And he was opposed to compulsion. But he was wrong. And the problem was that in this area, I will argue that unlike in many others, he lost his objectivity. The only solution he saw was the abolition of vaccination. The truth is, if you analyze the data and reanalyze it, it could equally well be explained that vaccination was only about 30 to 40% effective, which is easily credible, bearing in mind how it was actually delivered. And once we improved that, then it worked. He went, I think, to his grave believing that he was right. And he wrote in his own biography that I feel sure that the time is not far distant when this will be held to be one of my most truly scientific of my works. He thought this was more important than the theory of evolution. Trouble was, he was wrong. It wasn't his best work, and after all, vaccination worked. So what have we learned? The Journal, the Daily Mail, who has major issues on vaccination, presented this timeline. What were the important events in the MMR vaccine scandal that we actually had? The importance of opinion formers. The media thought it was important that somebody said that my child was vaccinated. He objected to doing that for moral reasons. He felt that it was a personal matter for the family. George III didn't. Tom Whipple, writing in the Times, produced this graph. He basically showed that when the first papers around the MMR appeared 1998, 1999, those papers were uniformly critical of MMR vaccine. The vaccination rates for MMR started falling. They held steady through the first area, and then newspapers started writing more and more about MMR vaccine. Oddly, most of these stories were very positive about MMR vaccine. But the thing we have to learn is every time it was mentioned, what the public remembered were these stories. And the vaccination rate plummeted. Tom Whipple's conclusion, not mine, was the best thing the press can do about MMR is shut up. The consequences were seen last year, somewhere I know well, the Swansea region, suspected measles cases in Wales as a consequence of those years beforehand, creating a susceptible population. There are cause and effects, and in particular here, the way the local media reported MMR vaccine has had quite a dramatic effect in that area. So lessons from history that should have been learnt but keep being repeated. Well, the biomedical construct of disease accepted by some in society does not conform to the evidence base widely assumed. Objection may not be rational, but objection there will be, and some will hold the right of the individual over the needs of society. And preventative measures requiring active participation require prolonged debate and education, as well as developing policy. And opinion leaders are vital, and the media must be responsible. Are we getting better? Cervical cancer vaccine seems to be very effective. Boy, would you like to do trials like this. Almost complete protection over 4 years from infection with the vaccine-related strains. Virtually no evidence of side effects. These are the vaccination rates for cervical cancer vaccines elsewhere. Britain does particularly well. The United States, with a very voluntary process, is barely hitting 30%. No herd immunity whatsoever from that. Why? Because they don't like the idea that educational material that was used came from companies, and therefore this is companies selling their material onto patients. Consideration of individual benefit versus societal benefit. And the press. The Mail, November 2011. Girl left in waking coma as a reaction, severe reaction to cervical cancer jabs. Following day, The Telegraph. Cervical cancer jab left girl 13 in waking coma. 24 hours later, online, they add claim parents. Why? Because, thankfully, Sense About Science objected to the Press Complaints Commission. Press Complaints Commission, unusually for it, upheld the judgment and expected that greater care would be taken when presenting articles on health issues in the future. That's progress. It's slow, and it might not be what you'd like to see as progress, but it really matters. Can it all be forgotten? Sunday Express. When we consider epidemics, and this is a personal reflection, several events change your own perception. And there are two events that I'm particularly proud of, and it's my total contribution to changing my mind. Came from a book written by Robert May and Roy Anderson called The Infectious Diseases of Humans. What they showed in that book is rudimentary modelling, and it is fairly rudimentary, could actually predict the nature of infections. And in 2007, during my time at the MRC, I was particularly proud that we actually created the Centre for Studying Outbreak Control, which was headed by Neil Ferguson and is based at Imperial College, and that includes Roy Anderson's work. Now, I'm no mathematician, and you're going to hear much more sophisticated stuff about modelers from those who really understand the field. But suffice it to say, the models work on the basis of a point infection occurring in a population which is either susceptible or infected or has recovered. That's the only simple outcome when you introduce an infection. Now, what was important about these models for a biologist is they showed that two parameters were of major importance. And I would go so far as to say that as biologists, we didn't think collecting data, and this is difficult data to collect on these infections, was actually worthwhile. This is where modelling changes the way in which you might approach trying to understand biology. The first of these is R0, which is called the basic reproduction number. That's the number of secondary cases generated by a single primary case coming into a susceptible population. Saw that number of 58%. That would be the R0 for varicella. And that tells you what the intensity of an outbreak is likely to be. Secondly, R0 and TG, the generation time, that's the average time for secondary cases to be infected by the primary case, how long the incubation periods things are, will tell you how much time you've got available to intervene on a population-wide basis. Now, that simple model requires a variety of modifications, and again, you will hear an awful lot of these. And you may say, what is the evidence that this actually works? Well, I'm going to take you back to the foot and mouth outbreak of 2001. And Keeling and Bob May made predictions, retrospective predictions, of where you would have expected the foot and mouth outbreak to be, based on movement of animals, farms, and intensity of those susceptible to foot and mouth. I'm just going to show you this picture, where cases actually happened and where they were predicted to happen. This does seem to work. And as the models have become more and more sophisticated, particularly work by Neil Ferguson, allows us to look at factors that can be used to control a flu outbreak. And this is taken from his paper in Nature in 2005. And there are two short video clips on this that I'd like to take you through. They're taking you over a period of 60 days of a point outbreak, 10 cases occurring in a rural area in Thailand and the peninsula leading to Malay, Laos, and the surrounding countries. This grey map is the population map, which is weighted for population movements that are known to happen in that country. In other words, the network through which an infection has to spread. If I run that movie on, what you'll see in red is the little outbreak occurring. Can't see it totally clearly, but you'll see satellite areas will happen and how quickly it's spread. This is about 30 days after the onset of that infection. The green area is showing recovery. And you can see it's actually spreading very rapidly through the population with gradual recovery in these areas. And you still retain, wherever you've got high densities of population, the infection occurring still in those areas. The time frame of this is of a mild flu outbreak. If you now begin to ask the question, what if you put an intervention in there? Can you model that intervention? Well, on this timescale, vaccination isn't going to work. And you've got a limited supply of drug, which could be effective in preventing that outbreak. Here, on the second video, you're now going to see what happens in exactly the same scenario, but this time the geography is moved next to the border of a country. One country which has a policy of introducing drugs to provide local control, which will be seen in blue, where those are centres that you start creating to give out a blocking drug to flu. And you will see in green where recovery actually occurs. Here is the outbreak, and you can see you're starting to exercise control of that outbreak. But what happens now is it crosses the border. You're now getting sporadic outbreaks elsewhere, and you're increasing the amount of drug that you're covering, but look what's happening on your borders and on your fringes. And now it reinvades back as you run out of drug supply in order to exercise that control. The points that Neil Ferguson made on that slide is to prevent a regional and global pandemic, you must be able to detect the first 40 cases, and your response has to be international from day one in order to exercise control, or you have got an international pandemic on your hands. And that is with parameters set very low for transmissibility. The game of controlling plagues has moved now from one society to multiple societies to get agreement across that multiple societies. And two scenarios are changing our positioning even further. The issue of terrorism and the fact that most plagues in the future are chronic diseases. Again, Riley and Ferguson began to use smallpox as a reintroduced agent. But now we're going to do, at least in silico, what somebody with malign intent might do in terms of the biology. The parameters and assumptions show you that this is the profile of infection that you are likely to get. This is the infectious period, and these are the various ways in which you will consider the subsets of individuals who actually will get infection. It is considered in the United Kingdom with a point outbreak in central London. And the idea here is that we have data which shows how population movement occurs at 5-kilometre radius throughout the whole of the United Kingdom. So we can create the network in a lot of detail. This is what happens if you use normal parameters for smallpox. Actually, you can control it pretty much within London. That means you've got at 75 days, you could have easily vaccinated the whole country, even making new batches of vaccine. So standard control measures would work. This is accelerated if you change 2 genes in the virus to make it spread faster. Your control measures are going to be virtually useless if you reside to what we currently have. In other words, we've got to develop new measures, map it, detect it, and treat it on a population-wide basis quickly if you're going to prevent catastrophe. But in the future, projected deaths and burden of disease in India shows that we are moving away from infectious diseases and the plagues of cardiovascular disease. And now we have a different scenario. The deaths and burden of disease is not going to be due to infectious agents unless they're introduced with malign intent. And you could say, probably we can do nothing about this. Wrong. Individuals can do something about it, and governments can do something about it. This is, as China is getting richer, this is the production of cigarettes in China. If we compare China in men, the number of cigarettes consumed per day in 1952, 72, and 92 is as follows, but eerily parallels 1910, 1930, 1950 America. If we get rich, we drink, eat, and smoke. It seems to be what the public wants to do. 12% of all deaths in America in 1950 were attributable to tobacco, 33% in 1990. China's population explosion might actually come to a grinding halt through its continued use of tobacco. Can the state do anything about it? Well, the most recalcitrant European population were the French. They kept on smoking. Cigarette consumption in France per day rose to the 1990s. Whether this has got anything to do with tobacco as an appetite suppressant, I don't know, but it's certainly something about the Gaulois image that still pertains French literature. What stopped it? Taxation. Raised the price, and people stopped smoking. So don't say the state can't intervene, and it's this sort of data that is getting the idea of sugar taxes and others involved. But if you want anything to really happen, the health education component here is now going to be key. So in finishing, I would say that major public health issues abound as our analysis of association and causality increases. Secondly, our capacity to intervene and monitor has now greatly increased, and we have got better predictive value, and we're going to get that better and better with each passing day. Therefore, the acceptability of intervention by society is now the key to the future. Population-wide intervention is the Bentham-esque greatest good for the greatest number, but there will always be casualties. If you had a terrorist outbreak and you knew somebody was going to be a major infectious agent, would you sanction the police to shoot that person on sight? Huge moral and ethical question if there was no treatment for this. How far would society be prepared to accept the casualties that are inevitable in these processes? What is the impact on individual rights? We go back to that age-old question of the rights of society versus the rights of the individual. And crisis intervention might make this acceptable, but how to judge and who decides? Do we say obese people should not have access to the same health care? Really issues of huge social importance, and the right to dissent that actually Wallace fought so hard for. But interventions requiring individual action require the question that I posed right from the outset. What is the nature of the belief of the individual in the value of that intervention? And don't think that their reasoning is going to be rational in all of these aspects. Acceptability of intervention. Most are going to require a short-term change. And actually many will be considered by the individual as unpleasant or removing a pleasure. I don't know how many of you used to smoke here, but you did so with a reason. I smoked for a period of time. It was pleasurable. I've given it up now, but at the same time, it was something that I've had to consciously give up. You've got to have a degree of willpower, and that willpower over a prolonged period is quite hard to achieve for any particular individual. What's it mean for the university? Well, simply, the bottom line is that understanding how society accepts an intervention is far more complex, as far as I'm concerned, than the biotechnical aspects of developing the intervention. Or to put it more prosaically, for those of you in particular schools in the university, my view is sociology, mathematics, and policy are as important as biology to successful prevention. Thank you.
So thank you very much indeed. We all knew about plagues that shaped history, the Black Death, Moses and the plagues of Egypt and the Great Plague of London. And then we think about our society today when we're so confident but kind of unaware of its fragility. We debate our prosperity endlessly, but we don't spare much thought for our sort of biological vulnerability. So we continue on this theme next week with Professor Chris Dobson and Dr. Mary Dobson jointly considering plagues in history. But again, and finally, we must thank the Vice-Chancellor for his insight. He's given us a huge amount to consider. That plagues can challenge everything about our society, our governance, our trust in each other, what is right, what is acceptable, and really, most of all, our mercy. Thank you very much indeed.